In Exodus chapter 23, the children of Israel are in the wilderness after being delivered out of Egypt, and the Lord God is continuing to establish his laws and commandments. Throughout the chapter, God reveals that true holiness always involves mercy, justice, compassion, and righteous treatment towards others, including the foreigner dwelling among them. And when God commands Israel not to oppress the foreign resident in Exodus chapter 23 and at verse 9, he is forbidding the exact kind of harsh affliction, abuse of power, and mistreatment that Israel themselves suffered under Egypt. Now, the nation of Israel is continuing to receive the fullness of the Lord God's law as he establishes how his people are to live, govern themselves, and represent him before the nations. And from verses 1 through 8, God gives commands about honesty, justice, and how the people are to treat one another, such as not spreading false reports, not following a crowd in wrongdoing, not perverting justice, not taking bribes, and even helping your enemy if you see his ox or donkey in trouble. These commands reflect the heart of God's law, because to love the Lord your God meant to keep his commandments, and loving your neighbor means treating others with kindness, fairness, and mercy in a manner that reflects God's truth. Now, when we get to Exodus chapter 23 and verse 9, God says you must not oppress a foreign resident. And this shows that these same standards of justice and love must also be applied when you're dealing with a foreigner or stranger dwelling among Israel. In other words, the Israelites were to treat the foreigner with the same fairness, compassion, and dignity they would want for themselves, because oppressing the foreigner would directly contradict the very laws of love and justice that the Lord God would soon fully establish. Now again, look at what the Lord God says. He says in verse 9, you must not oppress a foreign resident, because you, Israelites, were foreigners in the land of Egypt. Now the word for oppress is the Hebrew word lāḥaṣ. And this word means to press down, to squeeze, to put pressure on someone. And in this case, basically just means the use of power, position, or authority to crush, exploit, or press down upon someone, which in this instance is being applied towards the non-Israelite. The powerful part is that the Lord God roots the command in Israel's own experience. For example, later in Israel's history, we see that same Hebrew word lāḥaṣ used in Judges chapter 4 and verse 3, where the children of Israel cried out to the Lord God after being harshly oppressed by Jabin, king of Canaan, and Sisera, who was the commander of Jabin's army. Because of Israel's rebellion against the Lord, they were being pressed down, dominated, and afflicted for 20 years under the power of their enemies. This oppression was severe, involving military force and cruel subjection, which ultimately caused the nation of Israel to cry out to the Lord God for deliverance. You also see the same word used earlier in Exodus chapter 3 and at verse 9, where the Israelites in Egypt were being oppressed under Pharaoh's rule. The Israelites were being pressed down, afflicted, overworked, and harshly treated through slavery and abuse of power. So in both historical instances, the Lord God saw their suffering, heard their cries, and acknowledged the cruel oppression they were enduring at the hands of their oppressors, who were non-Israelites, by the way. So with all of that being said, it is very clear that the word oppress is used here to show active, power-driven mistreatment, and these are just few of many examples of the exact kind of oppression that God forbids the Israelites to inflict on foreigners who dwell among them. So brothers and sisters, when you bring that back to Exodus chapter 23 and at verse 9, you see that God is saying, when it comes to how you Israelites treat foreigners who are non-Israelites, people that are not native-born ethnic Israelites, don't press down on them, don't exploit them, don't use your position, your authority, or your advantage to make their life harder just because they're not from the same bloodline. Why? Because you know exactly what that feels like. You are the ones being pressed down in Egypt. You are the ones being taken advantage of. You are the ones being mistreated. You are the ones crying out under the weight of that suffering. You were the ones who knew what it felt like to be overlooked, powerless, and was even forced to give your beloved male children up to die in the hands of the Egyptian Pharaoh's harsh rulership. And you, Israelites, were the ones God stepped in to deliver. So don't turn around and become the same thing you cried out to be delivered from.